noticed, Rachel, while we were just kind of chatting, is that the three of us we've all been vaccinated, or at least partially vaccinated, and we've had 3 different shots. Have you been able to get a shot yet?
Yes, actually, I get my second shot tomorrow.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's very exciting.
Nice.
So which one did you get?
The Pfizer.
The Pfizer. Okay. All right. So it's like, so something
I'm
about
a
art
Moderna
historians.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something about the art historians, like they're giving them the Pfizer vaccine. So I got the Johnson & Johnson, and Varsha got the Moderna shot today. So.
Yeah, in case anybody was wondering why I'm wearing a blazer, aka a pantsuit today, you can't see my pants, is because last night I was like, this is the first time I'm leaving the house for something other than groceries. I only got to wear this pantsuit once for comprehensive exams. I think I'm gonna go dressed up, and it was great because I was on the BART and someone was like, are you going to an interview, like in-person interview? And I was like, nope, getting my vaccine, my first shot.
That's so exciting. So like they did a big at another university right next to Virginia Tech at their kind of athletic center. They did a big vaccination clinic for the regional health district. And so because my wife and I had been vaccinated, we volunteered there. And it was like the most exhilarating thing to be there because everybody was so happy and so excited. And like they were so grateful that people were kind of helping out. It was just a really kind of wonderful experience. So. Yeah, and I think, we hear a lot about kind of vaccine hesitancy, but, it was massively crowded. Most people want the vaccine as soon as possible, so.
Yeah, it was really sweet. There were a lot of older couples when I was getting my vaccine on Wednesday. And in the waiting period, they were just like quietly embracing and smiling at each other. It was like immensely like emotional, like I'm even tearing up now. And it was like really sweet, like one of them was like, how long is the vaccine going to last? And they're like, we're playing it by ear. So it was really cute and sweet. And like, I think it very much drives the point home. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say Philadelphia is not always the friendliest of cities, but I think people were just so happy to be out and seeing other humans, and everyone was talking to me. I mean, people were like rolling down their windows and asking me how it was and how I felt. And it was very sweet.
That's
Wait,
so great.
The city of brotherly love is not the friendliest city?
We like to describe ourselves
Varsha,
as gritty.
Yeah. So someday we should take Varsha to a Philadelphia sports event. Then you'll see how friendly they are. Yeah.
One of our mascots is actually called Gritty in honor of our Philly attitude.
Big green fuzzy thing. So
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. I think we should get going if that's okay. Let me first of all start as we normally do by thanking Rachel for setting everything up, and she will quickly or soon disappear into the background. But when you have questions for our guests, who we'll introduce in just a moment, please just put them in the Q&A, and Rachel will monitor those and send them our way. So thank you again, Rachel.
Hi.
Awesome. All right. So welcome everybody back to Drinking with Historians. We had a short hiatus because I can't apparently keep a calendar straight, and I had a conflict last week. This was entirely my fault. And so we had to cancel last week, but we are back and we are doing some old timey stuff, which I am very excited about. Our guest today is Roland Betancourt, who is a professor of art history at UC-Irvine. He has 2 books, which somehow came out in the last year or so, which I'm not at all kind of
shaming all of us, Roland.
Shaming all of us. That's right. For terrible. One of his most recent one, not the most recent one, is this great one called Byzantine Intersectionality, which we'll be talking a little bit about in just a moment. But the first question that we always ask, of course, on Drinking with Historians is, what are you drinking? So Varsha, what are you drinking today?
I am drinking an impulse buy because I had this at a bar a long time ago and I saw it in the store and I was like, I have to have this. It's the Bruichladdich, the classic laddie. So they say it's unpeated, but the thing is, every type of scotch, or every type of scotch has like a little bit of a kick. So like it's a little bit smoky. And it's one of my favorite scotches. Yeah. What about you, Roland?
I actually haven't been drinking much in a while. So I'm having kombucha, which is my go-to fermented drink of choice. Although in the rare occasions that I have anything to drink, I will have a mezcal because I like the smokiness of it. So I completely understand.
lovely. I mean, it is, in fairness, it is only 4 o'clock kind of where you guys are. So it's not entirely out of bounds.
That's true. And it's like 0.3% or something like that.
So technically,
yeah,
it's an alcoholic. So, but still okay to sell, the farmer's market or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of, well, in some ways it's kind of the perfect drink, right? So
and,
I would never say
they
that.
They don't require ID to buy kombucha, do they?
No, and this was like a big deal a few years back because they were like over fermenting on the shelf. So now they have hard kombucha and like the kombucha that's like, no, this is definitely below 0.5. So yeah, it was like a big thing. Like I can't, time is amorphous, but yeah. So, always pick it close to the expiration date, I guess.
Yeah. Matt, do you have a fancy cocktail for us?
I don't have a fancy cocktail. I do have a fancy whiskey, which I can't recommend enough. So I have Mixed Blood, which is an American whiskey by a distillery called Du Nord, which is out of Minneapolis. It's a Black-owned distillery there. And because my colleague and friend David Perry and I just finished our book, he sent me a celebratory bottle of whiskey, and he hadn't even tasted it, but it was like a local whiskey he'd heard a lot about and sent it to me, and it is phenomenal. It is so delicious, and I just absolutely love it, and I can't recommend it enough. It's DuNordSpirits.com or something like that. You can order it online. You should go do it right now. But I guess we should talk about kind of things other than my whiskey, though I could just talk about my whiskey. And as I was saying, like, I'm really hyper because like it's been a long day and I needed a drink, and so I'm like really excited to be here. But I'm also excited to be talking about medieval stuff. So I want to ask Roland a question. Get it kicked off. Recently, the thing that attracted my attention is that you were interviewed in Time about the Lil Nas X Montero video, and specifically about like all the imagery that was there. And it was an incredibly sophisticated video, and it was kind of panned and it was attacked, especially by conservative Christians, because of for devil worship, right? Like demonic imagery and stuff like that. But I want to read a little bit from this Time article, and maybe Rachel can throw the link in the chat if people want to look at it. But it says, Betancourt points out that in the Middle Ages, when Christianity was rising across Europe, the church's relationship to homosexuality was more ambivalent than it is now. He references historical texts about individuals who were assigned female at birth, but became monks in all male monastic communities, as well as brother-making rites, which bound two men in marriage-like unions. Homophobia was not always the central tenet of Christianity, he says. As a medievalist, modern Christianity seems utterly foreign to me, which I think is a really wonderful thing. But I was wondering if you could kind of expand upon it, because I think that oftentimes like there's that trope, right? The past is a foreign country, but it's kind of overused and not really used in kind of an intelligent way sometimes. But when we're thinking about religion, especially religion, sometimes when we think of as, or people oftentimes think of as being true through all time, it's hard to historicize that. So how do you how can you kind of expand upon what you were talking about there, especially related to kind of same-sex relationships and things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a huge issue. Of course, religions tend to always communicate the idea that, it's always been the same and that you are preserving some sort of orthodoxy or fundamentalism in what you are doing. And, the Byzantines are not foreign to this. There's always this like common trope and stereotype that the Byzantines were scared of change and newness. And so the idea was that even when new things had to be introduced, you had to always like justify that they had always been there. So you were just reestablishing what had already been there from the beginning. And so, I think it's definitely true of thinking broadly about Christianity, that a lot, of course, changes over, time, over centuries, millennia. But also in particular, I think as someone who works on the Byzantine Empire, whose more direct legacy are, various forms of Christian orthodoxy, whether it be Greek or Slavic orthodoxies, Russian orthodoxy, there really is also a heightened sense of like everything is as it was. And as someone who works on the liturgy, that's one of like the major points where you see so many scholars even filling in the gaps with what is done today in the rite, when we know that, of course, there's massive amounts of change from century to century, and this evolves and varies even at a single moment across various parts of the empire. And so for me, I think that's one of the things that's most important. I think one of the biggest tropes in thinking about issues like trans rights or like same gender desire and all of this, oftentimes it gets just sort of like there's this helplessness, like this learned helplessness, that there's this weight of history and that things aren't going to change overnight. And so for me, a lot of the effort is also to like sort of pull the rug from under that and to be like, no, there's actually been a lot of change and things actually do change sometimes overnight, essentially. And so that's for me something that's always really important to reiterate. And it is true, you know, as a medievalist, I sometimes am like, what's going on? Which I oftentimes enjoy in feeling that level of strangeness because I'm perhaps more familiar with the medieval early Christian iterations of rites rather than their modern iterations. So.
And I think that's, I mean, it's a really interesting point too, because I think, especially with the Middle Ages, but I think probably with any study of the past, right, is that there's a tendency either to kind of familiarize the past or to kind of make it other, to say like this, the past is nothing like us, or the past is actually kind of like us, and these are the things. But, you know, I think I love, one of the things I love about your work is that it really does a great job of kind of walking both of those things. It's like some of the things should be really familiar to us because they do continue, and some of the things should be really weird because these were different people who lived at a different time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, speaking of things that are sort of really familiar to us, you know, intersectionality is a really important term in your work. And I was just wondering if you could define how you use it in your work. And, you know, based on that term, how does your work fit into like medieval and Byzantine studies, like the larger scholarship?
Yeah, so my goal in my book was really to look at these various narratives. So the book is really these series of sort of diachronic narratives that focus on a particular theme in order to do the best we can to flesh out these sort of like overlapping categories and conditions of identity that produce their unique subjectivities. And for me, one of the most helpful things about intersectionality was not only to think about the ways, of course, that identity is an additive, there's no equation, these subjectivities are all unique because of their like multiple inequities and so forth. But it was also to understand that when accessing the past, intersectionality is very helpful to understand that an element such as class might protect some from being, you know, shamed or attacked, or any records being produced of their lives and the things they did that others might not have. So for me, like intersectionality was not just about contouring these subjectivities, but also to sort of understand the gaps that certain forms of privilege also create in the historical record. And so that was really sort of the methodological like approach that I took in that book, which really each chapter sort of like looks at a certain fragment with different overlaps, and then sort of continues to sort of crescendo or culminate as it moves through the various chapters, as more of like these subjectivities can be fleshed out and understood more holistically.
Yeah. I feel like, you know, one of the things that I think is really important is maybe, and this is my fault because I'm just hyper and you know, a little bit overexcited, is maybe we should back up, because oftentimes, like when I teach my kind of broad medieval survey, like I get to the point where I introduce the Byzantine Empire, and I had this revelation, you know, a few years ago. It's like I say Byzantine and the students have no idea what that actually means. So like, so what's your best, like, help me out, make me a better teacher. What's your like elevator pitch? What is the Byzantine Empire? Like, what is that thing?
You know, it's one of the things that I even struggle with, because even at quarter of Byzantine art, my students will be like, in the Byzantine era. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that's right, but not really. There's still like this confusion about Byzantium. And it always reminds me of this great scene from New Girl where Zooey Deschanel's character is like staying in a hotel and she's trying to have like a fancy night in. So she like asks for some erotic movies and she's like proposing various themes. And she's like, do you have any historical ones? Like one set in the Byzantine era. And it's sort of like this heightened niche thing that I always think about. I was like the sort of like weird
exactly
place.
What you're talking about. So, it's a great scene. It's a great scene.
Yeah, I know. I should just show that like when I start my class. And so I also think that, you know, one of the great things about students when they don't know anything about your area of study is that that's actually really cool, because I don't have to fight stereotypes. And so I get to always be like, oh yeah, it is the Eastern Roman Empire during the Middle Ages. And I tend to leave it at that. It's just the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages. Forget Eastern because they are the only Roman Empire. And so I tend to vary between various definitions. There in terms of, yeah. So that's one of the things that I always am very conscious about when I approach the topic. I mean, the reality, of course, is also that Byzantium, I tend to give the dates of like 330 to 1453, which is a very Constantinopolitan orientation to Byzantium as well. I often say that, Byzantium's capital is centered on modern day Istanbul, formerly known as Constantinople. That's sometimes helpful, but I think my students are just like, okay, so where's Istanbul? So
they don't even know the song. They don't even know the song anymore, do they?
They might be know the song anymore.
I haven't gone down that path.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't want to figure that one out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of any references that my students come up with. Usually it's zero. They might know something from Assassin's Creed, and I think that's about it. Yeah.
There you go. Video games. Always a good
this leads to my next question. That's sort of for Matt and for Roland. So anytime I'm teaching a US history class, it's very easy for me to be like, this is why this matters. This is why you should learn US history. When you're teaching Byzantine art, or when you're teaching the Byzantine Empire, Matt, like, how do you convince students, or what do you tell students if their faces are like, why does this matter? Which their faces aren't like that, probably, because you guys are good teachers, but just in case.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to say that, I tend to use some maps of some of like Byzantium's like terrestrial heights, I guess, like, expanded portions like after the reign of Justinian, and say like, you're basically looking at the empire that controlled the majority of the Mediterranean at certain points, and that lasted, especially in their eyes, as the unbroken continuation of Rome until the conquest of Constantinople. And even then, the empire exists in exile in various ways and has its own continuations into Russia and how they position themselves. Yeah. I also like to say that Constantinople was the envy of the entire medieval world, and I just leave it at that. Since, I like to emphasize, I don't know, I guess I'm falling into like Byzantine exceptionalism here, but I do try to like highlight the sort of more spectacular aspects of Byzantium. And so I definitely have an entire class that's sort of like if nothing else impresses you, like, how about you get impressed by like their technology and their like medical knowledge and, their military warfare, because does that help? Yeah. So I take various approaches. My whole class is just, let me convince you that Byzantium somehow matters, because I think you don't want to be convinced.
And I think, and there's a real poverty, right? Because there aren't that many Byzantinists who are teaching in American universities. Well, in universities, at least in the English-speaking world, and maybe I could expand that to Europe, but I don't want to kind of say anything about Germany because it's hard to figure out what people are doing there. But I mean, it's so integral, like what, when I'm teaching too, it's once it's introduced to them, I think it's one of the really great reasons for making sure that you include and talk about Byzantium is it was part of the medieval mind, like Constantinople, the East, meaning the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, all the way into kind of what we think of kind of modern Iraq and places like that. Like that was within their world. Like they knew about that place, they thought about that place quite a bit, and so this is very much like, just to pretend that it's just this kind of closed Latin Christian Western thing, it's not fair to them, right? It makes sense from a nationalistic historiographical idea that that's how medieval Europe is kind of taught, but it's really important to think about it. The other thing too, which I know Roland knows about too, which all medievalists and Byzantinists have to confront, is like white supremacists know about Byzantium. Like they care about it a lot, right? Like Jason Kessler, the organizer of the Charlottesville Unite the Right, like he started a group right before that called New Byzantium. Like this is a thing that white supremacists kind of pull on, and it usually has to do with kind of Islamophobia, with kind of false understandings of kind of whiteness and historicism and stuff like that. But like, students, like you bring that kind of stuff up, then students seem to understand kind of why this stuff kind of matters. So.
Yeah, Byzantium is very unruly because it is very placeless, and it is a sort of floating signifier in many ways, and it has a very splintered history in its sort of exiles. And that's something that also becomes very challenging, because Byzantium, yes, it can be the envy of the medieval world. Byzantium can be that heretical enemy that you ransacked in 1204 on your way, to be good crusaders. It's also that empire that you excommunicated because they are heretics, because they put yeast in the bread. This is what I always tell my students. I'm like, these are the things they cared about: yeast in the bread. Like, yep. They didn't like homosexuality.
They cared
was
so
not,
much.
They cared so much about
much.
that. Yeah. And so and then there's like the various there's like the various orthodoxies throughout the Balkans, which each have their own dimensions. The Greek experience, especially in the 20th century, modern politics affecting these. And you have, as Gibbon said, the effeminate Greeks of Byzantium in sort of the English-speaking world. And yet, at the same time, then you have these weird interests in Byzantium in the far right that really, I'm like, what is that? It's just a cloak for Islamophobia. So it's either an empire to be regained, it's an empire that you're in the lineage of, it's this validation tactic. It's a source of, it's oftentimes also like a reservoir of pain that can therefore be a sort of like approval for more violence. Like, there's so many permutations that Byzantium takes on in the present throughout the globe that it really is a very strange and in some ways insidious force in some capacities.
Yeah. Like, one of the things I've always kind of wondered about is, I mean, like, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but kind of knowing more of the American experience, because we teach here and kind of we live here and things like that. And then because of kind of professional experience, like knowing Europe a little bit, but mostly kind of France, Germany, England, Italy a little bit. Like, how is Byzantium remembered or thought about now kind of in modern Turkey, in Greece and things like that? I mean, one of the things, for example, like Erdogan very recently reconverted Hagia Sophia back into a mosque away from a museum. Like, that's not a kind of a value neutral decision, right? So do you have kind of any sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, like traveling throughout Europe and the Middle East, and Byzantium is very different in every space that you're in. The last time that I was in Greece and in Turkey was October 2019, which I keep wanting to say last October. And it was very interesting because in Greece, it was very much like, oh, I work on, like, I'm a Byzantinist or whatever term. And it was like, oh, so you're like a conservative, like you're like my grandpa. And it was like this thing where it's like, okay, I understand. And then I was actually going to Mount Athos, which is a topic on its own right. But essentially I was going to this monastic community, which a lot of Greek men, women are not allowed to step foot on the peninsula because it's reserved for the Virgin Mary alone. A lot that we can talk about Athos, but a lot of Greek men have done this pilgrimage to Athos. And so when I was saying that I was going to Athos, it was this very much like, oh, you're going to love it there, which was also fascinating because it just like, it had all these various conflicting identities of like, that was not Byzantium, but it was. Byzantium was something else. And then in Turkey, I think generally the feeling is, a sense of amusement. I'm like, why would you work on the Byzantine Empire if you could work on the Ottomans? I think that's generally the which, I understand. The Ottomans are quite fabulous. I always say that, one empire was replaced by a quite fabulous other empire. So in terms of, what they did in terms of architecture and art, both their politics were less than agreeable at many points in their history, as often comes with empire. But it's a very interesting dynamic to also weave through. And yeah, Erdogan, it's a very interesting conversation about Hagia Sophia because, of course, it's very important to the various Orthodox communities as the symbol of orthodoxy. It's also a rallying cry of converting Hagia Sophia back into a church. And there are all these complex histories of laments and so forth about the reclamation of Constantinople and so forth. And I think one of the most interesting things to keep in mind is that, yes, Hagia Sophia is an important church. It was referred to as the Great Church. And if you had a sort of Hagia Sophia in your own town, it would probably also be called the Great Church, as in the case of Thessaloniki. Hagia Sophia was also the imperial church. This is where coronations happens. This was the center of all the imperial ceremonies. It was always the center of empire, and it was the platform of empire and the stage for the ceremonies of empire. And so while, you know, there are very Trumpish qualities to Erdogan's rule, that move is in some ways not out of line with Hagia Sophia's history, which is a really painful reality that we have to always acknowledge. It's like Hagia Sophia was built after the city was destroyed and burned down by riots, and Justinian basically brought the people into the hippodrome and slaughtered them all with the Byzantine army. Like, Hagia Sophia emerges from a very dark period and a lot of imperial brutality. It's a sort of monument that in some ways deserves reevaluation in terms of its politics. And it's very funny because Justinian is often, as Western historians also know, praised for his patronage and so forth. He was also quite a brutal ruler who is commemorated only because he built tall buildings filled with gold, which reminds me of other people in the present. So I like to always, like, you know, push back against Justinian as much as I can.
Justinian would have had a golden toilet. Absolutely, he would have.
Completely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, Hagia Sophia was also built by university professors, essentially. So I just soft spot in my. They really didn't know what they were doing. They were just like, I've written a treatise on conics. This should work. But yeah, enough about Hagia Sophia, I suppose.
So, okay, so I haven't had the chance to read your books yet, but I know you mention and you talk a lot about people who lived transgender lives in your book, and so I was just wondering how you came across their life stories and how you sort of write about them.
Yeah, so these are very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of great work being done in Western medieval studies on a lot of these lives. So I do really want to give a shout out to that because of the fact that these stories, a lot of them have a very rich life in the Latin speaking West. And so there's in Latin and French and so forth, there are a lot of narratives that have, you know, very elaborate illumination programs and so forth. But many of these stories, which are essentially of figures who are assigned female at birth, but for the most part, they all live out their lives as male monastics. These stories have often been described as nuns in disguise, and scholars have really done acrobatics to always be like, oh, but her proper femininity shone through no matter all tribulations, and they always behaved in a feminine manner, which, you know, sort of a little bit mind-blowing to me when you have these amazing records of like these figures, because of intense deprivation, you know, their breaths wilted away and they were not like those of other women. They ceased menstruating, like a series of like bodily details that I also don't want to like sensationalize in their own, because I think that there's ample space for thinking, of course, of trans identity beyond just medicalized notions of it, but just evidence that I think that should have really given scholars for centuries reason to give more credence to what these narratives told. And so for me, there were always like these very uncomfortable things in the background of Byzantine studies. They're not really the center, they're not the most popular of saints, but these figures definitely have very popular stories that are being transmitted throughout the Middle Ages. And they're preserved today, both in the original Greek or sometimes in the earliest extant copies that are written in Syriac, but were translated from the Greek. So Byzantium also plays a very interesting role in being sort of like one of the first witness to these narratives and, you know, the authors of many of these narratives.
I think that's such a fascinating point too. I mean, I'm reminded of kind of this side Twitter conversation I was having earlier today, but it was that oftentimes, I mean, I think in different historical periods have to deal with this in their own kind of ways, but especially in the medieval Byzantine era, is that there's a tendency to think of these people as simple, right? And that these narratives, though, are deeply complex, and people could understand what these things were saying and what they were doing. And I think that we're sometimes, like, I think as you were alluding to, it's filtered through a historiography, which has in fact actually simplified it far more than it actually was, because they were trying to conform it to their own understanding of how the medievals or the Byzantines in this case were.
Yeah, completely. And I think one of the biggest lessons about writing this book, which is something that I've always implicitly known in being a scholar of Byzantium, but it's how much, I think there's a lot of like charges of anachronism, but it's really when those of us who do this work, but the real charges for me are how much we've molded the past into our stereotype of it. And sometimes it takes intense acrobatics to do that. And so that's one of the things that for me is very important. And you have texts that are transphobic, homophobic, that are medieval texts, and yet even those sources tell you so much about their concern about the malleability of gender and the body and how a figure is meant to understand their gender identity. So there's, for example, this example that I talk about in the book, which is discussing this how to write a refutation, and it takes the story of the virgin huntress Atalanta, and it just goes into this screed of paranoia of like, well, she couldn't have had like both masculine characteristics and feminine ones. This is not right. Her mother should have trained her right, so it is the failure of the mother. Like child rearing is basically a form of like gender, conversion therapy for children. Like if not, they will have surely like converted their gender. And I'm like, wow, you are paranoid and terrified because you know that gender does not the gender assigned at birth does not always adhere to someone's gender. Yeah. And it's so fascinating to see a text that is trying to attack this and just giving us as historians looking back so much vocabulary to understand the real anxieties that medieval writers had. And what's fascinating about texts like that is that they're not written as these disciplinary sort of homilies or even sort of penitentiary type texts, which have a very different tone to them. It's really, I'm just trying to teach you how to write an essay and where you're acknowledging the classics, where, gender fluidity is such a common trend throughout so many of those stories. And so that's one of the things that I think is very interesting. And one of the burdens of being a Byzantinist is also to always think that they had the more or less entire corpus of Greek antiquity at their disposal, and they could read it, and they did read it, and they annotated it, and they commented on it. And so that creates frustratingly erudite writers at many levels beyond what we often assume.
Yeah, performatively erudite sometimes.
Oh, right? Yes. I mean, that's probably like every time that someone tries to attack Byzantium is that they're like trying to just demonstrate how smart they are. And it's like, I'm like, well,
Yeah, there you are.
There you are.
So we are getting into the second half, and so I want to get to some of the audience questions. I had one more for you, though, is that, so this is something we ask a bunch of our guests, is like, so we always have to, as historians, right, confront pop culture. So is there any pop culture that kind of gets Byzantium right? And if there isn't, is there a favorite piece of pop culture that you use in teaching or something like that to show kind of what Byzantium might have been, might have kind of seemed like?
Yeah, so this is one of the joys of Byzantium, that there's absolutely zero pop culture. Like there's nothing. I'm literally like, oh, Justinian and Theodora, you couldn't have made a movie about them? Like, really? There's no Netflix special on Justinian and Theodora? Like, I don't understand it. I don't comprehend it. I like to tell myself that the sets would just be too expensive. But
what a fucking show that would be.
I know.
Like, can you imagine?
It would be so good.
It's also not hard. It's the secret history. It's the most scandalous and well-known text. Do a really like poor job at it, and you'd still like be addressing Byzantium. Like, it's sort of like mind-blowing to me that Byzantium doesn't have a feature film yet. And the one film called Byzantium is about vampires. It has nothing to do. Byzantium.
So wait, you're saying there weren't vampires in the Byzantine Empire?
I don't think there were any motel running vampires from
You heard it here. No motel running vampires.
But there might have been vampires.
Yeah, that's
I'm sure there's something close to a vampire in the secret history. I do have interesting references. My personal favorite is in the movie Suddenly Last Summer from 1959. It's based on a play from Tennessee Williams. And it's a fascinating story. It's very convoluted, so I'll probably miss something. But basically, Katharine Hepburn's character is very upset because Elizabeth Taylor's character is bad-mouthing her son, Sebastian. And so she wants to have her lobotomized by a doctor who's been specializing in lobotomies to help her. Why is she trying to lobotomize her? Because Sebastian was a poet, and every year he would go to Europe and compose one poem. Throughout his trips to Europe, he would use his mother to procure men for him to sleep with. And then his mom got too old to procure men, so he took Elizabeth Taylor, who was the cousin, to procure men for him. The men rebelled, and in Cabeza de Lobo, Spain, they eat him alive.
What is this movie?
So it's a fascinating movie about like the history of like homophobia in cinema. Like you cannot depict homosexuals if they have a positive story. They shouldn't be shown. They should end miserable. They should confront a miserable end. Anyway, so you have all this, which is always difficult to explain to students to get to like the key line. So Gore Vidal wrote the screenplay, and he introduces Katharine Hepburn's character by having this dramatic monologue as she descends in an elevator, where she asks said doctor, do you know anything about the Byzantines, doctor? And he's like, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the Byzantines. And she's like, well, it seems that the emperor of Byzantium had a throne that would rise in consternation of his viewers. But since we are living in a democracy, I don't ascend, I come down.
That's so
and
cool.
It's apparently such an important reference for Gore Vidal that when he was very old, like one of the last interviews he did, he had to be carried down the stairs. And he said to the interviewer, since I'm living in a democracy, I descend. So it's fascinating. He had just written Justin, his historical novel. Speculum had just published a publication on the Throne of Solomon, which is what he's referring to here. And so it's literally talking about the automata of Byzantium in this like really wonderful like passing moment that introduces Katharine Hepburn's character in this utterly insane narrative. I mean, it's perfect.
That's better than the New Girl clip. You must show that.
Oh yeah, no, it's amazing. I love to talk about it. I mean, it's a fascinating little glimpse. I mean, I do like to talk about the Lady Gaga Judas video also. But nothing has ever captured Byzantium the way that I wish it did.
Yeah,
that is kind of crazy because there are such, sorry Varsha, I mean there are such sources. I mean like what an epic kind of, like you said, like a Netflix or an HBO series would, I mean, the secret history is it's like right there. And that's just like the lowest hanging fruit, right? Yeah.
And it's really frustrating because there are all these Turkish movies about the conquest that depict Byzantium like, I don't know, like puritanical Protestants. And I'm like, with like empty white churches. And I'm like, what? like I get it that you're trying to somehow exoticize Byzantium and make them Western in some capacity. I think there's some interesting politics there, but I'm just like, you literally could just go into Hagia Sophia, you know, like, and so someday someone will make this movie, and I am 100% willing to be the consultant for the movie.
HBO, if you're watching.
Yes, please, HBO. You
email
the budget.
Email Roland. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Sorry, Varsha, you were just saying.
Before I ask my own question, because I will ask that later, but Mike follows up on this conversation. He was wondering what is the book the Byzantine book everybody should read? Is The Secret History a history book or is it a novel? I haven't read it.
The Secret History is it goes by various names. The Secret History is the most common. It basically means the unpublished in the Greek. And it was a text written by Procopius of Caesarea, who was Emperor Justinian and Theodora's court historian, essentially. And he wrote he had written several tomes on the empire. And one of them was on the buildings, which was all the patronage of Justinian and Theodora. Then he wrote one on the wars, which is all of his military conquests. And then there's this thing, which exists in one manuscript, that basically he begins by saying, I was there, I was in the room where it happened. and I'm going to tell you now what actually happened. And it proceeds from that point to scatter concrete historical details that we can corroborate by other sources into saying things like, at night, people who were with Justinian would see him start pacing down the hallway and his head would disappear. So it's literally Byzantium's QAnon. Like, it's a total, like, can you really believe this? Like, so he's a satanic force that's actually in control of the actual empire. It's literally like the deep state satanic cabals. Like, it's all there. And it's a fascinating, I mean, rhetorically, it's a great text just because it's that whole idea of like, I was there, I know it all, and this is it. And so historians always debate, was it sarcasm? Was it this like satirical novel that was meant for the elite? Did anyone ever read it? But yeah, it's graphically sexual. It just slut shames Theodora to no end. And it's quite interesting because as much as historians and especially Byzantinists try to be like, oh, that's all fake. If you ever ask a Byzantinist about Theodora's life before she became an empress, they will use references from the secret history, even though they will turn around and also say that it's all fake and you shouldn't believe any of it. But yeah.
Okay, so that leads to my quick follow-up. As a non-medievalist, non-Byzantine historian or art historian, what's the deal with Justinian and Theodora? Who are they and why do we care? Really quick.
Yeah, so basically they reigned during, Justinian reigned during the 6th century, mid-6th century, essentially. And they, I mean, there are many reasons. They did a lot of patronage of buildings. They had a lot of wars. They conquered a lot of the Mediterranean. They are most well known by their mosaic portraits in San Vitale in Ravenna in Italy. So that's like, if you know Byzantium from a history book, you've seen Justinian and Theodora in your history book, and that's probably about it. And so I guess in some ways we shouldn't care that much about them, but they're probably the easiest in route into Byzantium. And they are, I think, interesting because in many ways they're sort of almost like Roman in the minds of many. It's sort of like sometimes, you know, even in like the survey that I inherited of Byzantine art actually starts after the reign of Justinian, which is fascinating. I'm like, so I'm not supposed to teach Hagia Sophia. So they're like the quintessential like Byzantine imperial couple and also like the completely not. Yeah.
They're the Brangelina of the Byzantine era.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting too. I mean, you're absolutely right, because I mean, oftentimes, you know, surveys will rather than kind of start after, you know, if you're talking about medieval Europe, they'll mention Justinian, and then it's just kind of like whatever. You know, maybe they'll mention like the Comneni, that dynasty around the 1100s because it impacts the Crusades and stuff like that. But then it's just kind of whatever. But you have, I mean, not unbroken because there's civil wars kind of and usurpations like all the time. But, you know, what, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years of imperial rulers like throughout that period, and a whole lot of source bases. And that's actually one of the questions that, or actually a couple of questions that were asked is like what are the sources here, like for Byzantium? You know, you for example work on the liturgy, like what texts are you kind of looking at? But I mean, if somebody wanted to get a good sense of kind of look at a primary source themselves about what Byzantium, like what would you recommend there?
Yeah, a good source on Byzantium. I guess I'll keep that one for the end. I'll think about it some more. But I think in some ways, I'll be honest that the hardest thing for anyone teaching even Byzantine art is to find a good survey book, because the survey books flicker in between like hyper-focused and sort of also like too erudite. Like they expect you to know so much about Byzantium already to comprehend it. So even within art history, it can be very difficult. And then other books just leave out like the really interesting things about Byzantine history. So it is, someone needs to write another book about Byzantium that sort of freshens the history up for our modern world in many ways. But in terms of the sources, the Byzantine sources, I often, speaking especially as an art historian, although I'm the least art historian that you will probably meet that goes by that title, it's very interesting. I tend to say, if in the West you have treasuries and details of every object that you had and like all this sort of documentation, in Byzantium you don't have that. You have these philosophical treatises about what is an image, and which is why I'm a Byzantinist. But it is quite surprising. There is actually a lot of interesting material. Of course, there all the legal digests of Justinian. You have legal cases that are preserved, which are more difficult to access in English translation. You have, of course, a series of chronicles that are chronicles of different periods in the empire's life, or even chronicles since the beginning of time, which are fascinating in their own right. So you have all that. You have saints' lives, which tell you a lot about daily life in Byzantium and so forth. You have a series of medical texts. You have a bunch of medical texts that, some are focused on sort of surgery and how to perform a series of different surgeries, from like mastectomies for cancer to even like how to make contraceptives and abortives. You have...
They performed mastectomies during the Byzantine era?
Yep, at least our medical guidebooks tell us they did. And it's always a constant question as to whether these practices were done, but it is quite interesting. You do have a series of Western sources that actually will comment that in moments of need for certain surgical practices, they were like, oh, there was this guy and he was a Byzantine, so he was a Greek, and so he was able to perform this complex procedure surgically. So there's all these, I mean, that's the great thing about Byzantium. You do have all these various pockets of rich knowledge accessible. Not to mention, of course, all the philosophical texts from antiquity that also are filled with marginalia and commentaries on them as well. And so those are the types of sources we get from Byzantium. I guess if I wanted to introduce someone to Byzantium, I would really recommend Avril Cameron's Byzantine Matters. It's not going to introduce you to Byzantine history, but it's going to introduce you to the state of the field and the dynamic, complex politics of Byzantium in the present. And I think that's a really good book to understand why Byzantium matters today. And of course, the title is Byzantine Matters, which is a great title in its own right. And it's a tiny book, so it's really easy to read. It's like a one day, like next time you're on a plane, that's the book to read. Yeah.
Okay, so based on that, two people have book-related questions.
Yeah.
Michael asked what you think of Cyril Mango's work on Byzantium, and another person asked what you think of Gibbon's work, which is very long, on Byzantium.
Yeah, Gibbon is, can I say that he's trash? Yeah, basically just it was published in 1776, and it's just this disparaging account of Byzantium. It's just all attacks and its decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It's like, okay. Cyril Mango, who just passed away recently, is a fascinating figure, spoke just about every language necessary to understand Byzantium in its fullest. Some of his greatest legacies are just translations of Byzantine texts, which are extremely important. And also a lot of, one of those scholars who articles by him are still assigned with accessory reading to expand our knowledge rather than to completely say this is completely wrong. So Cyril Mango is definitely, one of the great founders of the field in many ways that really defined and made accessible. Other names like that, I would definitely recommend Alice Mary Talbot. If you want to learn more about Byzantine art, Henry Maguire and Robert Nelson, as well as, for example, Glenn Peers, who's a contemporary art historian as well. David Talbot Rice is the person who, if anyone knew about Byzantium in the middle of the 20th century, he probably wrote the survey book that introduced them to it. So many other recommendations in passing, but.
So we talked a lot about how you deal with, gender during the Byzantine era, but Jennifer asked a really interesting question. How does modern Turkey handle the Byzantine legacy? Do you see any issues with that or any good things that they do?
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, they're actually, contrary to sometimes popular belief by other colleagues, there are a series of thriving Byzantine studies programs at the major universities across Turkey and in Istanbul, like at Koç or Boğaziçi. You have a series of, Byzantine studies departments there. And so, and it's a lot of people doing really interesting work precisely on these issues as well. And so I would say very thriving community. It's just, of course, you know, it's that type of heritage that doesn't quite fit in the sort of like imperial aggrandizing narratives of the state. And so there are definitely issues there. And of course, also with sort of homophobic crackdowns and so forth that the state sort of weaves in and out of and varies greatly. And, you know, it is one of the challenges of Byzantium that it sort of appears in all these various fragments, both throughout Turkey and throughout the Mediterranean. You never can feel that you're sort of fully in Byzantium, even though it's always nice stepping foot into Istanbul and being like, oh, okay, I didn't dream this. This wasn't like a fever dream and I imagined all of this. It's like, here it is. This is it. Like it is, I am here. I am home. Like it definitely does feel that way. Yeah.
I'm so jealous that you got to visit. So like the last time I was in Istanbul, I was only in the airport. I had a layover. I was going to India. This was in 2016. And the layover expanded from like 3 hours to like 24 hours. And I was so angry because back then I didn't have a US passport. So I couldn't leave the airport. I was really bummed.
I mean, the new airport is a lovely airport with Byzantine flares, although I'm sure the official document is Ottoman flares, but yes, it's very wonderfully Ottoman Byzantine in many ways. Yeah, no, I love Istanbul and I love Turkey. I've gotten a chance to spend some time also in Cappadocia, in sort of central Turkey, and just running around caves and looking at wall paintings in these abandoned caves in the middle of nowhere. And it's a pretty amazing place, but yeah.
We didn't ask, how did you decide to study the Byzantine era?
Yeah, that was
it the caves?
No, it was not the caves.
You went into a cave and you emerged a Byzantinus.
No, it literally was one of those things where like I just stepped into my undergraduate advisor's office and I was like, I'm going to become a Byzantinist. And he was like, do you know Greek? No. Do you know German? No. It's like, okay, well, I don't know how this is going to work out for you, but it was very much, I knew I wanted to be an art historian, and I didn't know what period I wanted to work on. And, you know, in my world, I would be an art historian working on popular culture. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. And Byzantium was literally like, I could ask all the exact same intellectual questions. So I have no like attachment to like beauty, or it's a purely intellectual theoretical interest in Byzantium, which sustains me. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because I think, you know, Varsha and I asked this question of most of our guests, and it's oftentimes, it's a story very similar to yours, right? It's just like, I had a great teacher, right? Like I had an engagement with the material and I wanted to work with somebody, and that kind of led me deeper in. It made me ask, or there was the instructor took me seriously and let me ask these really interesting questions, and I just kind of, you know, snowballed from there. So
yeah, and when I was applying to grad school, the person I wanted to work with, Robert Nelson, the reason why I wanted to work with him was because of the sort of methodological interventions he had done in sort of historiographic essays on the history of art. And so I sort of became a Byzantinist to get to work with him rather than really to be a Byzantinist just for the sake of it. And so fortunately it worked out. I got admitted to grad school on April 15th, which, if anybody knows how things work, that means that I literally got admitted at the last possible minute. Allegedly, I sent an email to my advisor, who would become my advisor, because I was on the wait list. And I'm like, is this going to happen? And he allegedly barged into the room and asked that I be admitted. That is the sort of mythical story that I don't think is actually based on truth. But yes, I got in at the very last minute, and I'm very grateful for it. Yeah.
My story is not nearly as exciting. I emailed my would-be advisor like very early in the process, like sometime in like January, and he was like, shouldn't be telling you this, but yeah, you got in. And I was like, yes.
That's great. Yeah, no, I never got the experience, like the phone call or anything. It was a very like matter of fact, okay, we need to fill out the paperwork before like the end of the day. Like, there was no glamour to it whatsoever, which was, yeah, story of my life.
Simplifies the process. One other question, you know, kind of related to something you mentioned earlier, the succession of fabulous empires is is the movement between empires and the idea, like, and that also plays into, you know, what you were saying about Istanbul Empire Airport, right, which has Byzantine flourish, which I'm sure somebody would call Ottoman flourishes, which, right, like, there's a nuance there, like that. There's a reason that you could call them both. You know, in the same way, like you move from, you know, the Roman Empire to the Byzantine, I know it's the same thing, but, you know, the Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire to the Ottoman Empire, something like that. And also like other empires, like somebody mentions kind of the Parthian Empire, you know, or, you know, the Persians or something like that. Like, so how does that idea of empire kind of work in your own work? Like, how do you think about kind of the distinctions when, you know, they are kind of pulling from one another in many ways, oftentimes?
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the key things that also in some ways validates like the importance of Byzantium. Like, you know, Mehmet II did what his father could not do in conquering Constantinople. Like, there was great respect for Constantinople and why it was supposed to be the future of the Ottomans. And so, you know, when that slippage between, and I think that's, the slippage is really interesting because it's often understood also in a sense of like competitive architecture, that, you know, the architects are sort of like outdoing each other, which they totally are in the period. But what's also very interesting is that when you start building mosques that look like Hagia Sophia and like the churches in the city, you're actually rehabilitating that Byzantine heritage as part of the Ottoman heritage as well, because stylistically they become, you know, they're not one and the same, of course, but they are part of the same vocabulary. Suddenly you create it's a way of almost like forging a longer history. And I think that's a really like interesting approach of thinking less about a sort of very like modern narrative of like very neoliberal narrative of like competition and like outdoing oneself, but rather like a process of rehabilitating that narrative of being properly in line. And I think that is one of the interesting things about Byzantium and really the city of Constantinople, is even with the Byzantines and their relationship with antiquity of maintaining the pagan statues and so forth, who were these unruly things in the city that you always had to sort of mediate into that sort of like episteme. The same is true with the Ottomans. And so there's a very interesting dialogue there about how these empires are sort of eating up history into themselves, rather than attempting to erase that history as something that did not exist. Which I think is something really important to keep in mind in those dynamics of empire. And, you know, one of the things that's always on my mind is, of course, that, you know, I do work on an empire, and that it comes with all the violences and brutalities of empire, which is something that I don't think we really, as Byzantinists, ever acknowledge. We don't really think about what that means, and I understand why we haven't acknowledged that as much in the past, obviously, but it is an interesting conversation to moving forward of thinking about, can we write a survey of Byzantine art that maybe doesn't foreground, you know, the imperial church constructed in the ashes of a bloody, squashed uprising, riot. And so thinking a lot about what would be another history of Byzantium that is not about just the glorification of empire is something that's very interesting to me, thinking about,
so
you know,
like
these
a
various
subaltern history of Byzantium. Is that possible?
Yeah, and even like thinking about a history that is even like structuring that the surveys of Byzantium over an intellectual history would also tell a very different story. You know, you can sort of create an armature around that. It's just the spine doesn't need to be imperial succession. You can create even a narrative around sort of like the sharing of ideas and dialogue across the Mediterranean. It's dialogue with antiquity that would create a history that is in some ways the same and completely different in how we think about it.
Yeah, it seems like that political history, as much as there's so much really great work, I mean, yours among it, right? That kind of writes back against this political narrative, which we, as 21st century scholars, have inherited from many generations before us. But it's still there, like it's still, and it's something that, especially when we're teaching, like I don't know about your experience, but my experience, like it's something that students can latch onto. So it is kind of a crutch for us sometimes when we have to teach the period.
Yeah, it is difficult. Like students want dates, and imperial lines of succession are really easy to outline dates. And it's interesting because for me as a Byzantinist, like I don't remember the details of imperial dates, but I do remember when major schisms and controversies happen on theological grounds, because that sounds that is very important and has massive effects. Whereas imperial succession, of course, changes things, but it's not these like watershed moments that are completely revolutionary.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think on that note, we are just about out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation, a wonderful hour. Thank you so much, Roland, for joining us. You can find, as in the chat, and you can look on our bookshop link, his new book, or well, one of his new books. He has 2 new books. The Byzantine Intersectionality, which was out last year, and then just out this year is Performing the Gospels in Byzantium. And I'm sure he'll probably have another book out next year too, because that's what he does.
Stop showing off, Roland. We get it. We get it. You're
that's
smart.
right. So, well, he has to write his. He's actually keynoting the Medieval Academy of America conference next year in 2022 in Charlottesville, Virginia, which will be an in-person conference, we hope. So
Woo!
yes, that'll be great. And
Very
it'll be just up
excited.
the road. So I'll get to see him in person and chastise him in person about making us all feel bad as medievalists by writing so much. So yes. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding, of course. Roland, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody for spending your Friday evening with us. On behalf of everybody, join us in 2 weeks. Our guest will be Nils Gilman, and we'll be talking about the Cold War intellectual history. None of this more old-timey crap. We'll be back in Varsha's wheelhouse there.
In my house.
In your wheelhouse, that's right. So thank you, everybody. Until then, cheers.